Hi, sixth graders. This is a review of ordering positive rational numbers and comparing positive rational numbers in different forms as well. So first we want to look at numbers that are written in different forms. So we have a fraction, we have a decimal, and we have a percent. So we want to start comparing by asking ourselves, what do we know about each fraction? We know that 7/8 is greater than 1/2. We can write it right here. 7/8 is greater than 1/2 because 4/8 is 1/2 and 4 is greater than 7, so 7/8 is greater than 1/2. We also know that 7/8 is less than 1 because 8/8 would be 1, so we're 1/8 away from 1. We can also say that it is equal to 14/16 because I can do times 2 and times 2 to find equivalent fractions. And then if we write this on a number line and we have 0 and we have 1 right here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I know 7/8 we said is less than 1, but it's close to 1. And if we remember, 7/8 is the same as 0.875, also really close to 1. So we're going to say 7/8 is about right there. 8 7/10 is, so we know 8 7/10 is greater than 8. We know it's less than 9. We know that it can be equal to 8 7/100. Did I say 7/10? I meant 8 7/100 because this is in the hundredth spot. 8 7/100. It could also be equal to 8 14/200 because I can do times 2 times 2. And I can also move my decimal to the right 2, and I could write it as 807%. I could also, I'm going to write this up here. Oops, if I have 8 7/100, I could write it as an improper fraction because 100 times 8 and then add 7, which we didn't talk a lot about yet this unit, but 100 times 8 is 800 plus 7, so it would be 807 over 100. And then 807%, or 8 7/10, is going to be way up over here because it's greater than 8. And then we have 87%, which is, we know 87% is greater than 50%. We know 87% is less than 100%, or less than 1. We know 87% equals, 87/100, 0.87, or we could do 87 over 100. So if we look over here on the number line, I know 7/8 is 0.875. And then we have 0.87, so it's going to literally go even closer, right next to it, right before it. And we'll write it as, 87%, because if I write that as 0.87 and I add my thousandth, it would be 0.870. This is 0.875. 0 is less than 5, so that's why it's smaller than that. All right, fill in the blank with less than, greater than, or equals to make each sentence true. So let's do, So if we have, how can I move this over? There. 4/5 and 7/8. We need to get it to the same denominator in order for us to determine which is less than or greater than. Because 4/5 I know is greater than 1/2. 7/8 is greater than 1/2. They're both less than 1, so we need to get to the same denominator. So 5 and 8 both go into 40, I know. So if I change them both to 40ths on the bottom, I know here I'm just multiplying both times 8. here both times 5, so 8 times 4 is 32, 7 times 5 is 35, so then I know that 7/8 is greater than 4/5 because 35/40 is greater than 32/40. If I have 125 thousandths and then 10.2%, I can change this into a percent by moving my decimal to the right 2, and I would get 12.5%, which I know is greater than 10.2%, so then it would be 0.125 is greater than 10 2/10%. 5 43/100ths and 5 2/5. So 2/5 I know is going to be 0.40, but if I do this up here, 2/5 is the same as, and we can get it to tenths, remember? 2 times 2 is 4. 4/10, which is 0.4. So 5.43, and then 5.4. So 43/100ths is greater than 40, because if I add a 0, then it'd be 40. So that would be greater than. 5/6 and 0.625. So 5/6, if we do this down here, just to remind you how to divide a fraction, we have 5 divided by 6. I'm going to add a decimal with a bunch of zeros. 6 can't go into 5. I bring my decimal up. 6 can go into 58 times. 8 times 6 is 48. 50 minus 48 is 2. Bring down my 0. 6 can go into 23 times. 3 times 6 is 18. I'm going to write it over here. And then I have 2 again, bring down a 0, and I can see it's going to be repeating, but I can also right away see that if I have 8 in my tenths and 6 in my tenths, that right away I know that 5/6 is greater. 30% and 1/3. So 30%, let's rewrite it as, we know that 30% is 0.30 because I take my decimal 2 to the left, and then 1/3, as we know, or maybe need a refresher, is 0.33333 repeating, which would be 0.3 repeating, which if I round it out to the nearest hundredth, because I have 0.30, here I would round it to 0.33. 33/100ths is greater than 30/100ths, so that would be greater. And then 35/100ths and 3/8. 3/8, remember, is 3 divided by 8. Add my decimal and some zeros. 8 goes into 33 times. 3 times 8 is 24. 30 minus 24 is 6. Bring down the 0. 8 goes into 67 times. 7 times 8 is 56. Oops, which is 4. Bring down the 0. 0.375. So we have 35/100ths, or 350 thousandths, and then 375 thousandths, which that one is greater. So we know 35/100ths is less than 3/8. Write the numbers in order from least to greatest. So when we look here, we want to figure out which form is the easiest for us to transfer them all to. So I could do 1/4. I have 1/4, 2/10, and 22%, or 22/100ths. Sometimes with fractions, it takes us longer because we need them all to be with the same denominator. So 1/4, I know off the top of my head, is 25%, because remember 1/4 is 0.25. 1/4 times 25 times 25 is 25/100ths, which equals 0.25. 0.2, Move my decimal over 2, so that's 20%, and then 22%. So I know that 20% is the least, so I'm going to rewrite it in my original form, and then 22%, and then 1/4. So my answer in the end is going to be back to the original form in order from least to greatest. I have 1.2, 100%, and 8/9. So right away, I know that 1 2/10 is greater than 100% and 8/9. I know 8/9 isn't even a whole, so I don't really have to do anything but just use my number sense. 8/9, 100%, and then 1 2/10. Okay, we have 40%, 2 4/10, 4/100, and 4/10. So here I'm thinking it would probably be best to put it in decimal form. So 40%, I'm just going to rewrite them all in decimal form before I do anything. Would be 0.40. 2.4 is already in decimal form. 0.04 is already in decimal form. And then 4/10 would be 0.4. So I know 2 4/10 right away is my greatest. I'm going to write that over here. I know we have 40 hundredths. I can drop my 0 and have 4/10. 4 hundredths, and then 4/10 again. So 4 hundredths is going to be my smallest, my 4/10, and my 4/10. And then I rewrite it in the original form. So 0.04, I can do 40% or 4/10, either one, and then 2 4/10. Then I have 11/4, 2 6/10, 13/5, and 3.1. So this time, I think I'm going to try to put them into mixed numbers. So let's get a different color. 11/4, I know that 4 can go into 11 2 times with 3 left over. So 2 3/4, and I can check it because 4 times 2 is 8 plus 3. 4 times 2 plus 3 is 8, 11/4. I'm going to erase that though, so it's not confusing. So then we have 2 3/4. Here we have 2 6/10. 13/5, 5 goes into 13 2 times, which is 10. So 3 left over, 2 3/5. And then 3 1/10. So I know the 3 1/10 obviously is going to be my greatest, and now I have the rest of these to figure out. So 4, 10, and 5 can all go into 20, so I'm going to convert them all to 20ths. So 4 times 5, and then 3 times 5. So 2 15 20ths, and then 2 12 20ths, because I have to do times 2 here. And then I have 2 because here I have to do times 4, 2 12 20ths again. So I see that my 2 12 20ths are going to be my least, and then 15 20ths, and then the 3 1/10. So my 2 12 20ths go with my 2.6 and my 13/5. So 2.6, 13/5, and then 11/4, and then the 3.1. And then we can also put numbers on a number line to help us figure out where they lie as well. So we have 0 up to 5. So it looks like I could number this, I'll do black, 1, 2, 3, 4, which means that this would be half, and then this right here would be 1 1/2, 2 1/2, 3 1/2, 4 1/2. So 0.6 or 6/10, well 0.5 is 1/2. So 6/10 would be about right here. And we'll label that 6/10. 3 2/10. So 2/10 is less than half because 5/10 is half. So 3 2/10 is going to be a little bit closer to 3. So 3.2 we'll put right there. 40% is, remember, 100% is 1. So 40% is going to be less than 1. 50% is half, so it has to be less than 1/2. So 40%, a little bit closer to 50% there, would be right there. 1/2 would be right on the line, right there. 5 halves. So 5 halves. I can take 2 and ask myself how many times does it go into 5, which is 2 times. 2 times 2 is 4 with 1 left over. So 5 halves is the same as 2 1/2. So that would go right there. Like that. And then 24/8. Remember, this fraction bar is a division. So 24/8 is the same as 24 divided by 8, which would be 3. So then 24/8 would go at 3, which would be the same as 3. All right, that is all I have for this lesson.